I'm very happy to be here, and thanks for the Budapest Forum for having us today. It's going to be a little bit of challenging because so many things have been touched upon throughout the previous discussions, but we're going to do our best, and our best is good. So, as it's in the title, it's going to be a stock-taking conversation about energy independence in Central and Eastern Europe. And I think our region is particularly interesting to study and look at for many reasons, as it has been told before. Not only because of the traditional dependency structures on Russia when it comes to energy, but also because our region is in the front line of democratic deterioration, and when we are talking about energy independence, we cannot differentiate between that from the context of democratic security. So we have an excellent panel with us to connect the dots, and jump into the middle of it. I was thinking to start with Balázs. And let's start by talking about some numbers. So I'm going to take you this from 2020, the numbers of EU's energy import dependence was, if I'm not mistaken, 57.2%. And I wanted to ask you, how does it look like today? Mm-hmm. And what are the frameworks and programs within the European Union that could help Central Eastern Europe to reach energy independence within this context?
No, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I think it's also our challenge to wake you up a bit again. So, and I'm going to do that by throwing numbers at you. Isn't that lovely? So let's see how far we can take it. No, maybe just to start off with talking about stock taking. I will be talking a bit more about the European level, and we have experts on the region much more. But as you said, rightfully so, the challenges for the region are sometimes even more complicated than already at the European level. Just on the European level, our energy import dependency is just very high and has always been very high, and basically between 2000 and 2020 it has been fluctuating between 55 and 60%. So your 57 is probably pretty good because it's in that range. I do know that in 2021 it was 55%, so 55.5 to be precise if you really want to take notes. So it's just showing that we are basically still fluctuating. There are no dates yet on 2022, so but for now you do see this fluctuation of our energy dependency between 55 and 60%, and it's pretty stable. Then of course you can say, okay, now the war in Ukraine will change things drastically. Well, I have to disappoint you, because yes, it's changing drastically on our import dependency of Russia. But we are replacing it by LNG from other regimes like Qatar, also the United States, also Norway. It's not only bad regimes. I think Norway is probably the safest you can say. But so basically what we're doing is replacing our import dependency per regime. And that is also a bit the consequence of the program. So your question, what kind of European programs are there? There is the famous Repower EU program, which is really meant to build off our import dependency of Russia again. So the plan of Repower EU is that Europe is import independent from Russia in 2030. But again, then of course, if you look at the investment plans that are linked to it, that's a lot of LNG terminals. There is, of course, also on renewables. Yes, there is also acceleration on efficiency, but I think this very much links to the previous panel. That is still kind of, low-hanging fruit that we're not profiting from, that we're not sufficiently grasping. So still at the European level, energy efficiency, let alone energy sufficiency, which was discussed in a previous panel, Europe is underperforming, I would say. And as long as we're doing that, then of course our import dependency remains at that level. And that is exactly our vulnerability at the European level. I mean, when people are talking about the increase of prices, I think it's always important to call that fossilflation and not inflation. It is our dependency of fossils that is making our economy so dependent of the fossil fuel prices. And if someone decides to play with that, Putin, and by the way, this government playing along with that, then of course the impact on the prices can be very huge, and that's the fossilflation that we've been seeing. And yes, so last year we did see a reduction in gas demand by 20%, sort of, compared to the other winters. But of course, that's not in a way how you want to do that, because that's just mainly met by a very high energy price, which really led to a huge impact on the people who can't afford it. So you need a long-lasting program. We want to reduce those gas demands, but you need a program for that and not a sudden price shock as we've seen. And I think this is still one of the biggest challenges we're having at European level. So we do have our programs in place, but the mechanisms to really focus on replacing energy with energy we create ourselves, renewables, by reducing our gas demand, our fossil demand, that is still underutilized, unfortunately. And until that moment, probably our gas, our import dependency will go down a bit, but will still not deviate dramatically from the 50%.
Just getting back to you with one follow-up question. I remember you have been also arguing that what could be a solution within this package of how to deal with it would be putting back European Energy Union on the top of the agenda. Yeah. Would it be something which would be feasible? How would you describe very briefly what would be the key pillars and the most probable scenarios for such a, would it work as a format?
Yeah, now the Energy Union in 2 minutes, right? No, so, I mean, it's always good to put back that on the table, the energy union, right? But it's a kind of a mummy that is coming back alive every 10 years, basically, because still the biggest problem is that EU member states do not trust each other. So we can have very long discussions on the energy union as long as EU member states do not trust each other, still want to do their own energy mix, have their own decisions, do not invest in infrastructure where you also are talking about interconnectivity. For example, France with their lovely nuclear, they don't want any connection because they know they will be outcompeted. So they are very much against interconnectivity, has been very long. So as long as we are having those kind of problems, we can discuss any energy union you like, but it will not deliver what we need to deliver. That was as short as I could be.
Thank you. That was very concise. Balázs, feel free to respond to that, but I would like to give you also a very precise question about, revolve let's a little bit around the concept of energy sovereignty. Do we need to redefine it? Is it something new that we would need to have as a concept, or we're just...
In 2
no, you
minutes
have more than that.
I think I will. No, maybe I will have 3 minutes for the sovereignty.
No, feel free. Let's take 5 minutes and go into details.
When we spoke about it, that this will be the question about the sovereignty, I thought that, well, it's impossible to answer why, because it's so complex, the meaning of sovereignty. So I tried to copy the definition of sovereignty from the Cambridge Dictionary. There are 2 definitions as well. So there is a British type definition, which means the power of a country to control its own government. Well, interesting. So we can continue with the democracy impacts from this perspective. There is another definition, this so-called US definition. This is the power or authority to rule. Well, I think it's more interesting for us. And I liked very much your second comment on the problem with the European level questions. So whether do we trust in each other or not? Because what does it mean, the sovereignty? I think there are minimum 5 levels of the sovereignty. The first is the European level. The second is the regional level. The third is the national level. The fourth is the so-called company level or industrial level, because I think is also, if we use the second definition, it's again a very important, Rosa, you have mentioned it, it's another problem, whether does the economic actors sovereign decisions, or they have an opportunity to decide their business decisions on a sovereign form. And last but not least, don't remember, and you also spoke about it in your preliminary panel, the so-called individual or household level of sovereignty. So that's why it's so complex. I think there is a long-term fight inside the European Union between the member states and the European level of sovereignty. From the big picture, I think this is the key question. Because if we see the member states or the European member states are weak in the global competition, also Germany or France. Don't speak about our small countries. If we see together Europe, well, I think Europe can be a player in the global competition. If we compare the European added value to the Chinese, more or less the same. So half of the citizens, but approximately the same added value. But Bas, you have mentioned, I think this is the key on that level. The second is the reaction, and this is the other impact of the sovereignty, the reaction of the national governments on the last 2 years, huge energy price increase. Immediately, they stopped or they decreased the sovereignty of the market. Immediately, not only in the EU, there is an OECD report from last March, and they have analyzed all the OECD countries, and they have collected more than 90 measures in OECD countries which were direct or indirect impact on the market. Well, I don't want to argue that this is bad, because we see that it was a very special situation. But again, a question, what do we believe as a so-called, as a coordination or the main coordination framework of the energy industry? And we also need to speak, I think, this idea, it's more than an idea, but it's another impact, I think, the changing sovereignty of the corporations and the individuals, what you have spoke in the last round of your panel. Because the energy community idea, the prosumer idea, it's again a changing rule, changing authority to rule about the decisions. And that's why I think it's impossible to answer, of course, in 3 minutes. But what I have felt is that from one side, there is a fight between the European level decision makers and the member states. This is a challenge. And on the other side, the market actors and the government, plus the market and the actors and the individuals. So this is, if we follow the title of our panel, this is my stock taking from the sovereignty perspective.
Thank you, and we will get back to the issue of bottom-up power people type of approaches too. But first, I would like to cycle back to the level of the cities and turn to Ada and ask you, what are the remaining tools within a political environment like in Hungary for Budapest to achieve energy independence on the local level? Can you share some best practices and some constraints with us? Because we know there's a lot.
Well, yes, there is a lot. I mean, the cities are huge energy consumers, so it is important, and it's probably easier to tackle some of the energy issues because it is such a dense part of the country. I mean, for example, Budapest is pretty much consuming 20–25% of the electricity of the whole country at a time. And so it's, you can imagine that, you know, huge amount of energy needs to be pumped into the grids of just Budapest. And also people who live here and use this city, and I'm using Budapest as a demonstration, as an example, because, I mean, there are cities of this size across Europe or pretty similar ones. When 3 million people are affected by the impact of climate change, it is something in a city which is a different thing than having the same problem in a village or somewhere in the countryside. And if impacts like flood or heat waves are happening in a city, it is very disturbing, and if it lasts for a longer time, then it is a big problem for the city, the municipality and the leadership. And what is an interesting thing is how long can we still keep implementing mitigation measures before the adaptation is overtaking the whole problem. And then so there will be some point when these two things are getting together, and adaptation will be much more an imminent needs of the people, and then we will lose the momentum of saving more energy, saving more in a city where, or in cities, and so what I'm trying to say is that we have to be very careful of how fast we implement all these mitigation measures in Europe. It's not just about cities, it's about everything. Before we need to pour a lot of the resources rather into adaptation than just mitigation. And so this is one thing. But as a city, as someone who is responsible for some part of the city, I think our main rule and main role is basically to create an infrastructure, to create a city where the climate conscious choice of moving, using something is cheaper, quicker, and more comfortable. And this is, so I wouldn't put the blame on the citizens who are not choosing the climate conscious. We need to create an environment where that is the most comfortable to make. And this is what I think a municipality is all about.
We'll talk about the hook. How do you actually do that to get the people on board and change the mindset? Last but not least, Mihnea, I wanted to ask you about, you argue in your writings a lot about the importance and significance, or not so much of the significance of the carbon capture and storage. So can you a little bit explain us how do you think it's gaining a momentum on the European level? And if this is something which would be interesting for Central Eastern Europe, something which could be prominent. As far as I know from Hungarian perspective, there's a lot of regulatory gap, like remain to be discussed. I mean, there is some willingness to apply this or have this kind of approach, but when it comes to practice and enforcement, we're nowhere near yet with that.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks a lot. I'd like to start by being very grateful for the organizers of the forum for inviting me. As an alumni of CEU, it's a fantastic privilege to be here in this great building, which I never got to use. It wasn't finished when I was still here. But Budapest is a fantastic city, and I need to say that it's a great shame that such an important institution for social sciences in Central and Eastern Europe and for democracy, like CEU, is no longer here. But with that, to a slightly lighter topic, carbon capture and storage. When we were exchanging emails about organizing this panel, initially I was a bit baffled about combining the idea of carbon capture and storage and the idea of energy independence. But the more I thought about it, I thought that it's a fantastic leeway to point some of the potential issues that need to be resolved both at EU level, but also, of course, as you were pointing out earlier, at national level. So there is growing momentum, yes. There's over 65 projects in more than 15 European countries at the moment. We're seeing it in the policies and the regulations that are negotiated and come out of Brussels, out of the funding programs like the Innovation Fund, which has started to direct money, especially towards things like cement, which can use carbon capture and storage to eliminate some of its process emissions. For those of you that are not very familiar with the conversation in industry and in energy, these are emissions that don't come from fuel combustion, but rather from the chemical process, from the feedstocks that are used to make different materials and manufacturing goods. Now, what we know, we've heard earlier in the panel that there are scenarios that don't see the need for CCS. Some of them definitely exist. But I would say that there's a lot of evidence that to reach climate neutrality and to stay within 1.5 within a cost-effective way as well, carbon capture and storage is necessary. In the IPCC reports, we see about 3.5 gigatons at least of CO2 that needs to be captured globally. and in the European Commission's 1.5 scenarios is between 500 and 600 million tons within the EU. Of course, where does this captured CO2 come from matters a great deal. So, of course, there's high-value applications, as we call them, like cement and lime that we were mentioning earlier, where process emissions are very difficult to avoid. Of course, we can do things like material replacement, reducing the amount of content of those materials are very carbon-intensive. But there's also some more problematic uses, and I'll get to those into a second. But carbon capture and storage is also will be a key source of negative emissions. Because it seems increasingly difficult that within the timeline we have until mid-century, we can decarbonize all the emissions. There will be some emissions left, which we need to compensate. Of course, CCS is absolutely no excuse for us not abating emissions to the greatest extent possible. Now, getting a bit back to the discussion on energy independence, what's crucial to understand is that security of supply in Europe can no longer be built around fossil fuels. So CCS does not give any more license to operate for fossil fuel companies, and that's very important to hammer down. That means CCS is not going to save coal, as we hear in some of the Central and East European countries still in 2023. CCS is not going to somehow make gas peakers not have any emissions when they're needed for balancing. Very importantly, carbon capture and storage should not be applied in Europe in enhanced oil recovery, which is a method that basically pushes CO2 down wells for oil to make unproductive wells more productive. That's very much not permanent storage, the type of storage that we are envisioning for carbon capture and storage. So it is absolutely important that there is a value hierarchy, that we do differentiate between applications where this is necessary and when there are other alternatives that make more sense. It's important here to say that there's a lot of fantastic research that shows there's a relationship, an inverse relationship between cost reductions in renewables and the need for CCS. The more cost reductions we get in installing new capacities and integrating them well into the grid, the less necessary CCS becomes. And that's something that needs to be reflected in the upcoming carbon management strategy that the European Commission is working on. I know you drilled very recently the new commissioner that's going to be in charge of that. I just want to finish on this thought, that energy security cannot rely any longer on fossil fuels. We've seen in the crisis that even if we have some homegrown, let's call them fossil fuels, globally traded commodities like oil and gas have their prices influenced by global markets. This has spillover effects in our electricity prices. This has massive spillover effects and inflationary pressures on all types of goods and services in the economy. So yes, CCS is important. We need to turn the narrative on its head. It's time to make oil and gas producers, which have been promising CCS for a very long time, to actually take up the responsibility and deliver. There is now negotiations for the Net Zero Industry Act, which includes an obligation on oil and gas producers to provide storage for companies like cement companies, which need to capture some of their emissions. They must not oppose this, even though some of them definitely do, and they must act on their historical responsibility to reduce emissions.
Thanks for teasing this out. And I wanted to a little bit pressure further on, Bas, what you mentioned in the first round. And most of the climate experts would agree with you that instead of the EU swapping energy resources, it's technically swapping human rights infringements and dictatorships, speaking of Qatar, Egypt, and whatnot. But so, elephant in the room, what about China? How shall we de-risk dependence on China while we are pushing decarbonization? I mean, I know it's very difficult, would take probably a separate panel, but I think we should go into the core of it.
Yeah. No, happy to go into that, because I think also here the one-liner that we need at the European level is a sincere European industrial policy. That's what we need. I mean, let's be very honest, Europe has released its Net Zero Industry Act, already been mentioned, and Critical Raw Materials Act, and then we are pretending in Brussels that that is an industrial policy. It's not. It's totally not. We're only kind of arranging that we can do some mining in Europe easier, and we are fighting over what can be called a strategic net zero industry, which of course everyone wants to be part of that. So that's basically what an industrial, European industrial policy is at the moment. And I think this is exactly where we are so vulnerable, that we are, without a sincere European industrial policy, we are indeed just shifting dependencies. So either way, within fossils, as I said, but you're also absolutely right, if we go to more renewables, of course you also go to certain dependencies on metals and materials in China. So that's why finally Europe is growing up, you could almost say, is now also realizing that we need to do a bit more strategic thinking. However, until now, we have not come much further than, first of all, now, of course, for the first time, Ursula von der Leyen in her State of the Union announced that at least we are going to check, is China not doing kind of improper policies, market policies on their promotion of EVs, so electric vehicles, which indeed are at the moment much cheaper coming from China than what we can produce here in Europe. PS, so this doesn't mean, because sometimes people say it's the European policy that is kicking out our car industry. No, it's the lack of innovation of the European car industry that is now being outcompeted by the Chinese. That's what's going on. So, of course, we need to check whether the Chinese are doing improper policies with that, but let's be very honest, what the Chinese have been doing for more than a decade now is industrial policy. They realized that in the end an electric vehicle is superior to the combustion engine, energy-wise, cost-wise. But you need to invest in it, and that's what they've been doing. And they saw that you need resources for that, and they very, very clearly developed strategies to those countries to make sure they can get the resources. That's what China has been doing. So we can do two things as Europe, and that is kind of complaining about China, or maybe seeing that we need our own industrial policy. But then, and that's of course, then we do get into some nasty questions, certainly for this region, landlocked countries. And Hungary is a landlocked country, and there are in this region, of course, quite some landlocked countries. And I think here we still do not sufficiently realize how vulnerable these countries are, exactly because of climate change. The cooling water that you need for a lot of industrial activities will become a fundamental problem. So if we are talking about industrial policies on the long term, you need to also think of what does that mean for the different regions in Europe, because then you are properly and sincerely doing industrial policy at the European level. And then I do see that the landlocked countries in the Central European region are very vulnerable. And this is exactly the discussion you're having right now on these battery factories. Yes, I think part of the European strategy will be to also think of more battery production within Europe. But that doesn't mean you have to do it stupidly, right? I mean, you need to do that with proper thinking on what does that mean for the water resources, what does that mean for the environmental circumstances. So if this government is saying, well, Europe is pushing for batteries, no, we are pushing for a industrial policy on batteries. That doesn't mean that you think as a country where you have problems in 20 years' time with your water supply, you just build blindly with, by the way, dodgy contracts with Chinese and Koreans on battery factories. That is the problem, and we don't have a sincere European discussion on that. And that is really the biggest problem, I would say. And if we're not doing that sincerely and really asking the nasty questions on the long term, also for this region, then we are just shifting our dependencies from regime to regime, and we're not solving anything.
So Balázs, the same question goes to you with an add-on that, to top of it, like, can we be truly energy independent without bringing capacities, production home?
I do not believe in the energy independence in national level. So these countries can't be energy independent. It's impossible. So if we see only the Hungarian plans, for 2030, we will build 12 gigawatt solar capacities. The maximum consumption in Hungary is 7.5 or maximum 8. With the additional battery producers, maybe it will be 10, but not more. So what to do with the additionals? Of course, there are the long-term visions that we can use electrolyzers and store it as hydrogen or ammonia or something. But hey, it will happen in the next 5 years, not in the next 25 years. So realistically, it's impossible without cooperation between countries, between neighbors, regional neighbors. So what I really miss, and Bas, you practically mentioned it, that the cooperation or the co-creation and common thinking of regional partners. In Hungary, we does not have high mountains. All of our neighbors have. Why our government thinking about building a hydropumping storage? Austria, Slovakia, Romania, there are much better geographical locations to do it. Cooperation with Austria, they have wind and hydro, we thus have solar. It's a fantastic cooperation. Otherwise, we do cooperate now, based on market-driven coordination. Because in each sunny days, Hungary, which in average 25% importer of electricity, exports electricity at noon to all our neighbors. And so this is my problem about when somebody asks me about the independency, because I believe that independency need to define minimum on regional level and also on European level. And Bas, because you have mentioned this problem between this regional and European thinking, and I was very happy when you mentioned this landlocked situation of these countries. I think it's another problem that we need to put on the table that, and I'd like to go back a bit to the natural gas issues. I think for now, Europe has solved more or less the Russian problem. Changed the Russian import in 2/3 or 3/4 to other sources. And I think it's not only a replacement. It's very important because the form and the way of import have changed with the higher percentage of the LNG. LNG, of course, you have mentioned some regimes which is not so market-driven regimes, but in fact, LNG is a commodity product. So if you sign a contract, you have a cargo, more or less you can decide as a trader company where to deliver it. It's totally different from a pipeline type, monopolistic route, totally different. And so, for example, I do not have so frustration on reading that news that the Russian LNG export to Europe increased with 30%. It's a totally different way of exporting. In the LNG market, Russia is not a price taker. They also need to accept the LNG prices, totally different position. So that's why I think that it's very important, and why I mentioned it from regional perspective, because this is my frustration now, or it's the frustration because I have seen a similar situation in the mid of the 2000s, when we argued for developing the infrastructure in Central Europe, and I felt at that time I worked for the Ministry of Transportation and Energy. It was Economy and Transportation was the name of it, but I was responsible also for the energy. There was a lot of council meetings on the infrastructure development. We always got the criticism that this is not a European problem. Let's solve it. This is your problem. Well, for now, but I felt it, I heard it. So you know that now, again, it's more and more regional problem, but realistically, as you mentioned, the problem from the climate change issues, I also need to mention the problem of gas import in regional level. If you analyze the molecules in Austria, in Hungary, in Slovakia, you will realize that 90 or 90+% of these molecules are still Russian molecules. And it's also need to consider. And don't forget it that, yes, on European level we have solved, but we also need to find the ways of how to change the relationship between Russia and this region. And last but not least, about this regional cooperation. So you mentioned that the problem that member states has lots of conflicts. So now, in these years, we see it. So there is missing cooperation. Croatia immediately increased the transit fee on the pipeline from the Adriatic Sea to Hungary. Immediately. Well, oh, do you want to use it? Fantastic. And then pay more. Is it the way of cooperation? And of course, it was only one example, so I don't want to send a message to Croatian partners, but realistically, that's the case. So everybody like to be quick businesses as somebody has a need to the cooperation or to the help. And I don't know how to solve it. It's, unfortunately, this is the problem of our region. Yeah, I personally believe in the market coordination, and maybe the cross-border corporate level cooperation would be the only solution to solve it. If the energy company champions would not be national champions, but more regional champions, maybe they would be enough power to do this against all the national governments.
Thank you. Just because you argued so convincingly about you don't believe in such a concept as energy independence, I want to get back to Mihnea about Romania and ask, because Romania is known for its diverse energy mix and the low level of dependency in the energy sector. So what are the best practices over there? Do you believe in the concept of energy sovereignty and independence?
Yeah, so for those of you that may not know, Romania's energy mix is surprisingly well balanced for a region that's dominated by coal, especially lignite. So over 60% of the electricity production is clean, and Romania imports only about 10% of the gas it consumes. There is one big reason for this, and listen carefully, it's luck. It's geographical and geological luck. We just happened to have mountains, rich hydrography with a lot of rivers, sit on a lot of hydrocarbon fields. So this has contributed a lot to the security of supply, and I'll get to the energy independence issue in a second, of the country. Which of course is not a model for ensuring security going forward. I will mention that there has been some actions at governmental national level that have helped. So these are mainly about the uptake in renewables. There was a very concerted governmental effort in the 2010s to increase the share of renewable energy, and that has led to a boom. Which after that has dwindled as the support measures were phased out. But then the private sector has slowly started picking it up. And a sort of good practice, if I can call it that example, is what's happened during the energy crisis. Romania is one of the first countries to reach its voluntary gross electricity consumption reduction targets of 10%. But that wasn't because of something that the government did. That was because of citizens. Part of it was because of the national context, which is people don't trust government. So they didn't, even if electricity prices were capped, they just didn't trust that this will be maintained for a long time, so people changed behavior. But also very importantly, people started installing PVs on their rooftops, unsubsidized PVs. There's now more than 1 gigawatt, most of which has been installed over the past year, which is contributing greatly right now to reducing peak demand for electricity in Romania. Now, getting a bit back to how Romania was sort of lucky with its hydrocarbon resources, production has been decreasing every year because it's more than 100 years of using oil and gas in Romania. That's natural. But earlier this summer, we had the final investment decision in an offshore gas field in the Black Sea called Neptune Deep, where the hopes are to extract about 100 billion cubic meters of gas, which would make Romania the largest producer in Europe. Now, there is only one case, I think, that stands for supporting this type of an investment, and that's if it helps neighboring countries like Hungary, like Austria, like the Western Balkans to wean off Russian gas. So if that's the mentality, then there's a case for it. You are right that Europe as a whole did very well, but I think in the south we're still very much dependent, on the inflows of Russian gas. Of course, from an environmental perspective, it doesn't really match the decarbonization trajectories that we need. And that's it's problematic because we're seeing right now in Romania this type of resource nationalism that's frankly a bit ridiculous. So the argument I was mentioning earlier is definitely not something that resonates domestically. There's this idea of gas as a transition fuel that's very pervasive. When there were conversations about the taxonomy, I just did not get why they cared so much about this. And the reason why they cared about getting gas in a shape in which they'll never actually use it was so they can label gas a transition fuel. And that rhetoric is leading to a lot of investments in new gas electricity production capacities, of expanding the gas grids and locking in future consumers for a fuel that's going to be increasingly more expensive. We know that because there's going to be fewer users for the same infrastructure, and because ETS2 is going to put a carbon price on the heating of homes. So there are some problematic dynamics there. I just wanted to reply very quickly. You were speaking with Bas earlier about replacing dictatorships. So Romania, for that 10% it imports, that's very important in the winter when it's sort of peak cold season. We are replacing that with deals with Azerbaijan. Yeah, and we are doing precisely that, swapping dictatorships. Earlier last month, the Free Seas Initiative Forum was in Bucharest. It was hosted in Romania. And I witnessed an absolutely incredible panel, which was the panel of energy ministers from all the Free Seas region, so that goes from Poland all the way south to Bulgaria. But it was also the ministers of Georgia, of Azerbaijan there. And the representative of the Azeri state reserved half of his presentation to speak about the economic reconstruction of Nagorno-Karabakh. Yeah, of the fantastic investments they have lined up there, about all the good they're doing for the region. And that was before the final invasion. That was at the time at which all the supply lines to the region were completely cut off. How was that intervention met? With complete silence. No one dared say anything just because of the same type of dependency that we're having on Russian gas. We're replacing it with another dictatorial regime, which is obviously problematic. But linking a bit back to what we were saying earlier about how you can't build security of supply on fossil fuels anymore, there is abundant clean energy in the region, and tapping into that is super important. And I want to speak just very quickly about offshore wind, which we're finally seeing some positive developments in the Black Sea. Romania and Bulgaria alone have about 200 gigawatts of natural potential of offshore wind, about 50 gigawatts of which is for fixed offshore turbines. Which is great news. Offshore wind is fantastically helpful in the decarbonization context, especially because the wind blows for longer and harder in the winter. And as we decarbonize the building stock and electrify houses, this will have a great contribution. Of course, it needs to be a collaborative project. Us, with some partners from Bulgaria, we started what's called the Black Sea Renewable Energy Coalition, which has the purpose of coordinating efforts between not just Romania and Bulgaria, but also Ukraine and Turkey to develop offshore wind in the Black Sea, and also export between one another. And that's related to what you were saying earlier, which is why I don't like the term of independence, of energy independence very much. I find it a very, very American understanding of viewing the energy world. I don't think we should even strive for national energy independence because it's more expensive, is less reliable, and because at the end of the day you need to build the entire infrastructure across the European Union for a grid that's going to be dominated by renewables. And that's why you need electrons to flow freely from all points across Europe, from north to south, from east to west. I'll leave it at that for now, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks. So, Ada, I promise you to get back to the people's power and how household and local communities can they have a major role? And if so, how can you hook them in to win the hearts and minds of being participating actively in this type of transitioning and, at the end of the day, decoupling and creating more independence energy-wise?
Yeah, I mean, if we want to use the word independence, probably if we use resilience, energy resilience in this regard is probably much better, but obviously, and it's no-brainer that the first step is lowering demand, and the second step is, satisfying all those demands by supplying from locally and renewable sources. and technologies. And well, what just recently happened in Hungary is that, I mean, we last autumn we launched our city solar map, which shows to every people how much potential is there on their roofs in this city. You can't see any blue roofs on it. Obviously, it has an architectural problem also, or obstacle on this. But basically, what happened 2 weeks after this launch, that the Hungarian government put a stop on implementing more on the feed-in of solar household appliances, or yeah. So since then, there is a confusion in the society about solar, and you can imagine that in a country where you can win elections with lowering energy tariffs, it's not really desirable for the government to have households supplying themselves by their own energy. So, I mean, from political point of view, it is very kind of obvious to me that it's an easy way of making people, you know, confused about an investment which would concern a considerable amount of their savings to put into either supplying their own energy needs or lowering their energy demands. And obviously, if the natural gas price is much lower than the market price, or there is a very artificial way of pricing household energy, then it creates confusion and doesn't give the signal of energy efficiency is something what is desirable and better for the whole society, actually, because it doesn't just generate CO2, but it generates in a city of Budapest, like a city of Budapest, air quality problems as well. So, yeah, having said all this, I guess it is obvious that I mean, from our perspective, it is very important to have our own supplies, our own solar, how to say, capacity to build in the city, because it creates really a resilience for the city, which produce, by the way, 38% of the GDP of the country, the supplying of electricity to these very important services. And yeah, but on the other hand, it is probably in the rest of the conference, you talked about the problem of accessing funds of this city. So if we don't have the ability and the opportunity to disburse European funds, cohesion funds, to exactly those sectors where it was targeting, or what it was targeting in the very first place, climate resilience, climate mitigation, then we can only help citizens with information, really. And this is the only thing what we can give. We can create solar maps, brilliant, marvelous. But, and we can also design new financial schemes for households to be refurbished. But if there is no resources which is giving a very high non-refundable grant part of this energy efficiency investments, then people are not going to do that because of other economic reasons, and I don't want to get into that, but yes, it is important. And finally, yes, it has a democracy aspect. If we create our own energy, that's a more democratic way of supplying ourselves with energy. And education in this regard is a very important thing because, well, my definition of democracy is that you make informed decisions on a societal level, and if people are kept away from that very important information of how much energy costs in this country, then that's not going to be a democratic decision, even on the local level and the household level either.
To a little bit further pressure on that, I mean, I wanted to ask as a follow-up, Balázs, what you think about, how do you assess, in general, the role of energy communities, and how is it functionable in a political environment like in Hungary, where very often you have not been having a society which is well informed?
Thank you very much, because I also wanted to react on others' comment on this, because I see on a bit different this. So practically, I try to be not so critical to the government. So if I follow the legislation, for example, this year there is a new legislation and they implemented some new, or will implement because it's under discussion, but will implement new laws on energy communities. I think, you know, if you read this regulation, I think it's fair. The problem is, what Oda mentioned, the cost cutting or the non-market prices of the energy. And because for the households there is no price signals, it's a totally non-market driven decision by the households about their energy consumption. Let's share with you one example. In Hungary, you can get a very, very low level electricity till a limit of your consumption. It's 2,500 kilowatt hour per year. Over this, more or less doubled the price. This is the regulatory price regime. We have the same logic in the natural gas. So until 1,800 cubic meter per year, you got a very cheap, over it a high price. Last year, what was the reaction? And that's what I want to demonstrate, that the households are not stupid. They immediately realize what is the framework, and they will adapt to that framework. What happened last year? Government, because this new regime, when there is this limit, is brand new, so it implemented last year because of the Ukrainian-Russian war. What the households did, this new law that there is a limit of the gas consumption, what they did, immediately switched from gas to electric heating, immediately. Is it good? Well, I don't know. Practically, we produce the majority of the electricity also from fossils, so I don't think that from energy perspective, this is a fantastic news. Why they did do? Because if you have electric heating in parallel with the gas heating in your house, you are happy. It's an arbitration opportunity for you, which immediately did. If you also have a fire on old, how it's say in English, this stove, yeah? In that case, you got 3 times the subsidies. This is the best, because there was a regime for subsidizing the firewood as well. So I think that from one side, this is the real energy independence of the households. If I have all of these 3 types of heating, I am independent. Is it fair to another household which decided to drop out the old gas boiler and change to heat pump and realize only one time the subsidized price? So this is the problem, and so what I see now, that households are very, very realistic. So they follow what happens, but it's true that unfortunately in their expectation is that nobody will change the current price regime in Hungary, because if we try, will lose the next election, simply. That's the fact. And I don't know how to solve this problem. But I think this is the heart of the problem. And that's why I am not, frankly saying, yeah, it's a nice idea of the energy communities and we will share it somehow, but it will have a very, very limited impact on the whole game. So that's the problem. Maybe 3–5% of the households will have a realistic, so we'll really have a economic signal to join this type of cooperation form because of the fixed price offer from the government. And while we do have this regime, I don't believe that it really can change. So that's why I want to do this distinction between the regulatory framework and the so-called and the real world.
Thank you. Please.
Just a quick remark. And I mean, imagine that all this creativity, energy, and time, what all these citizens and households put into using that little window to utilize the subsidized electricity and gas price would use for making real energy efficiency investments. And this is the catastrophe of these policies, that we are using all this social energy and attention towards something which is just basically cheating.
I'm going to give the opportunity for Bas to respond to whatever he would like to respond to. But before that, I ask you, the audience, to also to prepare your questions, because I'm going to open the floor very soon for the Q&A.
No, but I think I think one of the problems that you're seeing here is that energy for national governments is too often a very nice kind of, means of keeping your citizens dependent. And indeed, what you see quite often is that before every election you are doing some stunt prices on energy just before the elections, because it's basically buying votes. The moment you give away the power and the sovereignty over energy, and this is why governments quite often like the centralized energy, and that's why they go for nuclear and all these kind of things, and don't like renewables that much, because you give away the power that you are having over citizens. And that's I think what we sometimes are really underestimating, how energy is just a power tool over citizens and keeping citizens as a consumer instead of an active citizen, which you can become once you are much more with energy and own supply and own production, etc. So I mean, that's I think I would like to stress, because I see that certainly also here with Fidesz, for them energy is a lovely way of keeping citizens dependent, where they can play with just before the elections.
Yes, I think we can establish that. So right now I'm turning to the audience, and I already see 1, 2, 3, or 4 hands. Great. Let's start with in the first row here. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to link energy policy with industrial policy, as energy policy normal is the first step for having an industrial policy. Very much focused on the region, quite industrial one. So first, how the electricity market reform will affect industry and energy prices. We are talking about energy prices. In the future will be mainly electricity prices, but there will be a part of industry that will depend upon the cost of hydrogen and other ways of decarbonizing. The point is how we can have a green European industry without too much subsidizing. It's to say, to make the best and most the smartest way of doing it. Right now, energy system or hydrogen plants are made to keep mainly German industry, even though it's an expensive and not efficient way of doing. So my point is there any plan for the region if electricity prices make industry away, because that could be a massive social and political problem for a region that's already problematic for Europe?
Okay, let's maybe collect one more. Okay, from the front row.
Yes, hello. Having lived for nearly 2 years in Hungary before joining IEP, I have a certain affection to this country, and I'm a bit concerned about the recent developments during the past few years. As we all know, as a result of the COVID crisis, but also the energy crisis, there were two major packages that were introduced by the European Union. Altogether, I understand that due to some of the concerns related to the application of rule of law, at the moment there are some 10 billion euros being frozen regarding funds to be given to Hungary because it has not been able to implement the rule of law properly. Has this been discussed generally within the Hungarian public? Because, I mean, 10 billion euros is 1/8 of the Finnish national budget per year, and it would really make a difference in Finland if we learned that the government has caused such trouble that we are losing money here, and a lot.
Thank you so much. And Goran Budovski is also raising hand from the back, and the gentleman here.
Goran Budovski, Open Society Foundations. I actually would like to tie to the last speaker what he said about the decentralization of power and giving power to the citizens, because actually that's exactly what could and should happen with greening. Now, there are several experts on energy. Who is there to lose from that, and how much money are we talking about? Because in Europe we lost sense of billions, millions and whatnot, but who will lose? Because obviously here the energy market was centralized, government to directly control. But for example, if tomorrow there is a 20–30% of efficiency, are we talking that also who will lose millions or billions, and not only the citizens, but also those who pocket the money in a captured state? So you're expert in the field. Hungary, any other country, more than welcome to learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you. So lots of questions on money, and there is a gentleman here who would also, and this is going to be the last one we take, because then we need to wrap it up in 5 minutes, I was just told. So
Thank you very much, and thanks for yet another great panel. I have comment and a question for Balázs, actually, because I could not agree more about the centrality of industrial policy. I work for the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. We've been fighting for that even during the years of Washington Consensus, where it was the policies that shall not be named, according to the IMF. So it's welcome. And it's not only about lack of policy on green transformation, also on the digital side. The European Union is lagging behind. See, China was able to catch up with the US, with the Silicon Valley. This unfortunately did not happen in our continent. I'm a European as well. And it's not only China enacting and crafting industrial policy, US as well is doing a CHIPS Act, Inflation Act even more, are a fantastic example of green industrial policy, why we are lagging behind. Now the question is, industrial policy, it's about changing the structure of production. And whenever you change the structure of production, this entails sort of distribution of benefit. In order to be able to enact this kind of policy, you need also to be able to compensate among the winners and the losers. So the question is this feasible given the status in which the Union is now? The problem between countries that Balázs was mentioning, the problem between institutions. It's Mihnea, no? Mihnea was talking about the Azerbaijan, no? It's like there was a contrast between the parliament, a motion against also what the president of the commission was doing, going to close relation with Azerbaijan. So in this context, we can envisage the capacity of the European institution to craft such a challenging industrial policy. Thank you very much.
thank you. So,
yeah. Shall I pick up the last one, because for the rest there was quite some questions specifically on Hungary, and I happily let that one pass. Just on your question, I mean, it's easily said. But that's my role here on the panel, right? But there is, of course, a very clear reason why it's not being done. And that is that's, well, as I gave an example on landlocked countries, I think the future of landlocked countries is really one of those challenges. But then we need to ask ourselves very difficult questions. And at this moment, the institutional setting is just not to do that. Because we have already so many problems, so many issues with each other, that we are kind of, okay, let's not do this. But then the problem is that at a certain moment we will run into this kind of, you can now already foresee that in 10 years' time this region will have a major challenge. So we are, you know, full speed approaching a wall. And basically we have so many problems with each other on rule of law, etc., that we are just hiding. Well, in 10 years' time, we can't break anymore. So it's really, that's why I do think that what needs to happen, because this is something that it's difficult to expect from the Commission. They just don't dare. I think we need a couple of heads of state in Europe who are putting this on the agenda. Just starting smaller, but really kind of, guys, what we're doing now, we're all seeing the problems in the world. We see all the regions in the world reacting, and we see that Europe is incapable of reacting properly. Someone then needs to ask, what we are now seeing is that countries all are inventing the wheel. So we are now having 27 countries inventing their own wheel, and the wheel usually means, how can we maintain our industry as it is? Well, I can tell you one thing, in 20 years' time, the industrial landscape of Europe will be different than now. How different? Let's discuss. And there will be differences between regions, and as you rightfully said, there will be winners and losers. And there we need to prepare for, because if we're not doing that, then the divisions you see now already growing in Europe will only increase. And politically, this will mean, you know, a great future for the extreme right, who of course will shout that it's because of foreigners, Europe, Brussels, everything else. But this is something we really need to take on head on, but this means nasty questions that need to be asked, and I can only see it happen at the European level if some heads of states are putting this on a strategic agenda to start off with. If not, we will run into this wall that we can foresee now already. That's unfortunately the grim message that I can only give on that question.
Who would like to pick on the difficult financial aspect of the questions?
Well, on the specific Hungarian ones, but if you want to give advantage to other questions, I'm happy to pass on. I think if we discuss the total amount of money, what is at stake in terms of the energy business, it's probably in the order of magnitude what was mentioned yearly. 8 billion euros, 10 billion, something like that. The question is not who would lose to use it properly, but who would gain if we don't use it properly. And this is the big question, that basically household targeting, I mean the money what was about targeting household energy efficiency was redirected to be used by public institutions, and it gave to the public institutions 85% non-refundable grant money, and guess what? Probably half of it went to somewhere else, then into insulation materials and new windows and new heating systems. So this is one gain. The other gain is obviously the political gain of being able to basically regulate the household and the consumers' emotions by giving them this fake kind of fake assumption that they are given some subsidies by the state and they are using cheap electricity or natural gas because Orbán is so nice to them. And so these are the basic things what I see in this whole policy, which is really, this is my picture, what I would draw out of the colors I have.
I think it's always are winners and losers in each economic transaction. So practically, if we begin at a non-Hungarian level, let's see the last year profit of the biggest oil companies of the world. Saudi Aramco, best of ever profit. 160 billion US dollar profit in one year, in 2022. So who are the winners? No, there are winners always. Here I think what Odo mentioned, and this will be my comment on local perspective about it, that for example, only one example about the central heating system. Here in Hungary we have a relatively big frequent central heating system. Approximately 600,000 households are in the central heating system in Hungary, so it's really a big one. Last year, the additional requirement... Fifth of the households, exactly, thanks. So that's last year, the additional request from the central heating companies to a subsidy because of the high gas prices was 2 billion euros. 2 billion euros only for that. The reason behind, first, 70% of the central heating system is still gas-fired. Second, the quality of the buildings, what Odo also mentioned. You know that who are the losers? I think that the whole society is the loser because we missed the reconstruction of the buildings, and it's still missing from the funds, what you have mentioned. That, so what is the missing funds? I think because this is the element of the whole puzzle when I feel that it really requires a non-refundable subsidy from the EU funds because very, very long is the break-even point or this is the problem with the insulation or the reconstruction of the building. So this is the answer. And to Rosa's question about this industry and price connection or interconnection, I think that the whole question is a chicken and egg question. I was very happy when Bas mentioned as a part of the European industry policy, this, for example, this battery industry. This is one of the 8 key technology you have voted, and this is an amendment or an appendix of the Natural Industry Act, exactly, Net Zero Industry Act. So from that perspective, I think Hungary is the good guy. We did investments in one of the key technologies of that 8 listed technologies. This is one interpretation, while others only speak about it. So this, you know, that I think it's important. So this is not something theoretical. This is one of the 8 technologies. The second, of course, about the comparative advantages. So this is closer to your questions that well, if you do not have cheap electricity and cheap gas, and we realize that this requires a lot of electricity and a lot of gas, it's much more a question mark than a good decision to invest so much in that industry. However, I feel this question is a very, very complex question because it's not easy answers on that because I see that somebody need to do this because otherwise, you mentioned also this competitiveness problem of the European automotive industry. We need to realize it, and you know that Hungary is one of the most connected countries to the performance of the European automotive industry. So from that perspective, I think it has economic rationality. Closer to the energy impacts, what is the typical answer, not only in Hungary but other regional countries, is the more centralization of the investments into the energy sector. In case of Hungary, of course, this is the new nuclear power plant program, to build a new nuclear power plant with more baseload electricity because this industrial players requires baseload. The other governmental program is to invest in new CCGTs, to new gas-fired power plants. Why? Because I spoke about the dynamic increase of the solar, but the solar also requires flexibility. So as an additional source, it again can be rational. I am not happy that all of these programs are government-driven programs, did not driven by private entrepreneurs or private investors. It's another part of the question. Why? Because 1.5 decades ago, when the last big gas-fired power plant has built in Hungary, it was with 0 government subsidy, based on private capital.
Unfortunately, this is where we have to close the panel.
yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but I have to. So thank you so much for your expertise and insights, and thank you for staying with us. We know that this was a very long overdue with the previous panel, and please feel free to reach to our panelists and ask your questions, whatever remained, and you would like to get off your chest. Thank you for your attention, and please give a huge round of applause for the excellent panel.